We have Dr. Seth Farber joining us here on the broadcast, PhD, Institute of Mind and Behavior, New York City. He's a writer, social critic, dissident psychologist. He received his doctorate in 1984 and co-founder of the Network Against Coercive Psychiatry. A critic of the mental health system, Dr. Farber believes many people have been wrongly diagnosed with mental disorders in an effort to build a captive market for drug companies. Well, yeah, they call it New Freedom Initiative on record. He became a supporter of the mental patients' liberation movement in 1988, 4 years after receiving his PhD in psychology. He's also a best-selling author, The Spiritual Gift of Madness, The Failure of Psychiatry, and the Rise of the Mad Pride Movement. We're going to get him to describe what that means and also give you his website. We'll have that on screen. But, Doctor, good to have you on with us today. You know, I saw an article today saying I'm a schizophrenic in the newspaper. They were saying I'm delusional that we have a corrupt government. Psychology Today had a psychologist, actually he was a psychologist who worked for the Obama administration and Clinton, come out and say he believes I'm mentally ill because I believed in NSA spying, I believed in secret police, I believed in NDAA. That was 2 years ago. Now all that stuff's admitted. And I guess if I was in Nazi Germany 65 years ago and said Hitler was a bad guy, they probably would have locked me up, too, saying I was crazy. He used psychiatry and corrupt psychologists as well. So thank you for joining us, sir. You're really one of the leading experts on this. And we also have your amazing book, The Spiritual Gift of Madness, The Failure of Psychiatry. We don't sell it, but it's available everywhere. We should be selling it. Tell folks about your awakening and what we face and where all this is going. And then separately, I want to ask you about the fact that I do see, not what I'd call so much mental illness, but people that are really screwed up, who are nothing but pure kind of narcissist, obsessed with status, obsessed with sitcoms, drama, kind of the Madison Avenue shallowness that I think robs their humanity. Because I do think there is such a thing as screwed up people, obviously, and some people that have chemical imbalances. But break down your awakening and your stance on what's really going on in the human brain.
Okay, what you said, Alex, reminded me exactly of how the psychiatric system was used in the Soviet Union to lock up dissidents, and they were called schizophrenics. And to call you a leader in the movement against the development of an oppressive state that deprives Americans of their constitutional rights shows, in fact, that the Psychiatric Institute is not a scientific process, the process of their psychiatric Bible, the DSM-5. And I have been saying this for years, that there's really no difference between the way psychiatry, you know, little differences, but basically it functions as a tool of suppression in America, as it did in the Soviet Union. And this has become, for example, you were called, I myself, one time, I was a critic, of the burgeoning child welfare system in the 90s. And I went into court for there were people who had their children, I know you talked about this before, many people in New York who had their children taken away by the child welfare system, and this is just one example, and when they protest, and if they speak of, well, I think that the court is collaborating with the child welfare, immediately they got labeled paranoid. And when I went into court as an expert witness for a person, at the end, the other side, the lawyers for the other side, the child welfare, tried to prevent me from giving my expert testimony on my client who had her child taken away from her. The judge let me testify, but at the end of the whole thing, it was me and another social worker, and we both testified that the woman's name was DeAndrea, was perfectly sane. Now, she was going on record as being distrustful of the child welfare system and of the court system. Well, even by their own standards in the DSM-4 at the time, paranoia is not a distrust of the government. It's a pervasive distrust, as it was defined. But what they did was, in order to disqualify my testimony, they said that I myself had been inducted into the my patient's delusional system. So we see how psychiatry has been used as a tool of political suppression.
By the way, Ernest Hemingway, for those that don't know, said the FBI was harassing him and tapping his phones, was declassified about a decade ago that indeed they were harassing him and tapping his phones. They had him grabbed and electroshocked, destroying his wonderful mind. And then he later committed suicide because he was so depressed. So that's an example of how these people operate, and it's ridiculous. The New York child welfare system is on record testing lethal drugs on kids until they die. You better be paranoid of that. Yes,
we have a terrible, Robert Whitaker has documented in his books, and Peter Bregan, we have, because of the growing psychiatric pharmaceutical industrial complex, we have 1/4 of American women are now on psychiatric drugs that don't do any good, antidepressants and so-called antipsychotics, which cause all kinds of. There is this psychiatrist that did a study on it, Irving Kirsch wrote a book on it, showed that actually the antidepressants don't do any better than placebos.
By the way, I've read your writings and I know about you. You're obviously hyper intelligent. What is it? I'm not bragging about myself either. Not that I'm super intelligent, but I'm not dumb. People think if you are electric, alive, smart, inventive, that's weird. I see the general public acting like zombies, and then if I act excited about something, about art or anything, it's like weird. Like, why are you upset? Or why are you excited? Like, I'm only supposed to get excited about football or something.
Yes. Increasingly, people... I don't know, that's not you. I'm going to take it away. People are labeled manic. I mean, they have now, broadened the definition of manic in such a way. Plus, they try to get these people, like children, who show an enthusiasm in a classroom, and... Bruce Levine, the psychologist, has written about this, who are often, instead of, they're not interested in the classwork, but if you test them intellectually and cognitively, they do as well, if not better, than so-called normal children on all the cognitive tests except one, route learning and memorization. So, they don't have the same tolerance of the kind of pablum that they're taught in the schools.
That's right. They reject Pavlovian programming.
Mm-hmm. And they get labeled. I mean, the clearest example of the fallacious nature of psychiatric labeling, of course, was the 1977 vote in the American Psychiatric Association, when overnight homosexuality went from being classified as a disease to an illness. Now, you don't vote, you don't find, specialists voting on whether cancer is an illness or not. And yet this is the way psychiatry proceeds. And even the editor of the Psychiatric Bible, this Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Diseases, who wrote in the 1980 edition, has become a critic of the recent edition, and he speaks about how we can save normality, the whole imperial medicalization of normality, and a bonza for the former. So these gentlemen and a few women, mostly gentlemen, get together and decide what is sane and what is insane.
Exactly. It's like some type of papal council deciding on what in the Bible is true or not, and then they'll contradict what they said 10 years before, showing that it's all just their opinions, and then who finances them but Big Pharma, to where they're now saying, I've seen these questionnaires to 11-year-old girls, do you ever get upset? Do you ever have anxiety? Do you ever cry? Well, you need serotonin reuptake inhibitors, my darling.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And this has spread to the point where Francis talks about the medicalization of normality. I became a critic of the system a few years after my PhD, and at that time there was still talk about the Rosenhan experiment. Did people still know about that one? Because I swear to you that the same thing would happen today. They made no progress. That was when David Rosenhan, the psychologist, wanted to test how good his fellow colleagues in mental hospitals and psychiatric wards were at detecting schizophrenia. So he and a couple of his, about 12 confederates of his, got into the loony bin by pretending they were hearing sounds. They didn't actually say voices. They all got in. They were diagnosed schizophrenics, and they couldn't get out. They acted normal. They could not convince the psychiatrists that they were normal, and they were examined by psychologists and psychiatrists, and each one said, well, they had a terrible... When they interviewed them, they say, well, the terrible childhood actually produced a predisposition towards schizophrenia. So, you know, Americans should not put their trust in doctors who can't tell who's sane and who's insane. Now, that was an experiment done in the 70s, but I find the same thing today. My first client was labeled schizophrenic. He heard a voice, and this is what I say, mad pride, because the mad pride movement says people can be different without being mentally ill, without being stigmatized, without meaning there is something wrong with them. And that was done so beautifully by the development of the mental patients liberation movement in the 1970s, when here these were these people that were supposed to be, that's the other side of the Rosenhan experiment. These were people who did have voices, who did have breakdowns, but became political activists and say, you can't, to the government and to the psychiatric establishment, you cannot make us take these drugs because they are killing us.
Well, let me ask you a question. Because so many times I see it as toxic waste and chemicals associated with things like schizophrenia, the old Mad Hatter thing, people working in factories, you would have higher ratios of it. But I am seeing more and more, and I don't really study psychology, but what I would call narcissistic breakdowns, where people just have lost touch of what reality is, but the system doesn't even call them insane. That's kind of like a manufactured corporate weirdness, but then they don't call that crazy. I see people going along with the system as mentally ill.
That's exactly what R.D. Laing said. Are you familiar with Ronald David Laing, who
no, I'm not.
Became a celebrity in the 60s when he said that normal people are crazy? He said the well-adjusted bomber pilot, this was during the war in Vietnam, now they have them dropping bombs without any pilots in the planes on innocent people. He said the well-adjusted bomber pilot is actually a greater threat to the survival of the species than the schizophrenic who thinks there's a bomb inside him. So, I mean, there are people in positions of power and authority in America who are doing terrible things, but, I mean, they're responsible in the psychiatric pharmaceutical complex for putting all these children on psychiatric drugs. That I don't defend, I don't excuse, I don't forgive the number of children who are being labeled attention deficit and even put on antipsychotics since the...
And for those that don't know, that causes major brain damage. That's in the news. I'm no doctor like you, but don't those antipsychotics really hurt the brain?
They do. They cause Parkinson's-like system called tardive dyskinesia. Now, they claim the new ones don't, but that's because the tests were really rigged. But they cause diabetes, and they still do cause tardive dyskinesia if you're on them for a long period of time, which is a...
What about this? Because I know you run about this. The really smart people I've known, like mathematicians with 180 IQs and incredible musicians and people that... It seems that, and throughout history, this has been known by the ancients, what they call insanity is genuinely paired with hyper-intelligence and creativity. I mean, is that a fable, or have you seen that?
I have seen that. That's why I support the Mad Pride movement. I thought that was such a brilliant idea when Sasha Dobrow in 2005 took a different... Before that, you had the Mental Patients Liberation Movement, which was, once again, led by a group of people who were supposed to be incompetent and incapable because they were all labeled schizophrenic, the majority of them. He gave it a different twist and said, a lot of us are hyper-creative, and we have hyper unusual ways of thinking about the world. And I have found over and over again that the person that gets labeled, today they get labeled bipolar. And when I was in school in the 80s, they were labeled schizophrenic. They tend to be more creative. You will find genetically that there's a higher amount of what's called I'll call it off-the-wall thinking, discrepant thinking, but it's really the basis of creativity. Whereas the normal people, I would call them sociopaths. I mean, because here they are doing these things, often aware.
Well, they're more like robots, programmable demonic robots.
Right.
Who will, I mean, I use the example, but it's culturally, they're not even like real people. They just do whatever they're told.
Yes, they have no conscience. You're right. They're like cogs in the machine. And Lang talked about it in the 60s when he said the crazy people were really beginning to see, the people labeled schizophrenic were beginning to see the light, and they may be lost and they may be having troubles, but they were spiritually exploring things, whereas the normal people, the psychologists, the ones who made the rules, the one who say whether homosexuality is an illness or whether it's not, the one who today are putting all our youngsters on psychiatric drugs, that are, and they call them antipsychotics, that in itself, they are cogs in the wheel. But what's disturbing, as you say, is that they do it without any conscience, just as if they're machines, just as if they're robots.
Well, listen, in the 5-6 minutes we've got left, I want to get back up for a full hour sometime to take calls. I see the artificiality of the GMO, the vaccines, all the studies, the brain damage, the 10,000% increases in pediatric cancers, thousands percentile in diabetes. We know this modern system's killing us. And then when we say something's wrong in society, let's even find the answer, we're told, you're crazy. Now, the people saying this, they know that opposition to corrupt authority isn't mentally ill. I mean, yeah. they would label the founding fathers or Goethe or Voltaire as mentally ill.
Yes, well, they have the definition, oppositional defiant disorder, and so they label, and that's why I compared it to Russia. You have young people who aren't going along with the system, who may, don't find school boring, but will come home and spend hours on the computer. They get labeled attention deficit disorder. More likely, the people that get those labels are the ones who are resistant to authority. So there's a political dimension to this whole thing, and even the awareness that these drugs are killing them. Because, for example, David Oakes, who was the founder of Mind Freedom, which is the largest mental patients liberation organization in the country, when they first gave him this drug, he had a terrible reaction to it, as most people I know do to these that's why the establishment is always trying to push the drugs on them and say, well, we need to do this to protect America. That's always the line, like the National Security Association. We're doing this to protect you. And, they always can find an example of someone who did something frightening. And for that one person who did something
Sure. Well, my dad going to UT, did his residency stuff, part of it at the state mental hospital, and he only worked there a few months and couldn't do it anymore. He said the people running it were 10 times crazier than the people that were in it down here off Shoal Creek in Austin, Texas.
Yeah. And they're destroyed by the drugs. When they want to get off the drugs, that is called an illness too. Did you know that, Alex? That just the fact that they want to get off the drugs is considered an illness. They call it non-compliance. They say they don't want to get
really,
better.
They're authoritarians. Like, there are some problems out there, but they're authoritarians just using this as a power grab and as an excuse to be abusive because they want to carry out these dreams of being sadist.
Exactly, and because they're rewarded for it now, in 1978, the American Psychiatric Association got together and said, we are facing, and you can read this in my book and in Peter Bregan, psychiatrist Peter Bregan's book, we are facing too much competition from social workers and psychologists who are doing therapy. The only way that we can survive and flourish is if we accept money. They had laws and rules against accepting money. There were some ethical boundaries. There are no ethical boundaries. I like in 1978, when Peter Bregan warned against that, it was like Eisenhower warning against the military-industrial complex. Because just as we have a military-industrial complex that needs wars, that profits from wars, so we have a psychiatric-industrial complex that profits from putting our children on these awful so-called medications that are really destructive drugs.
Absolutely. Well, look,
I mentioned children, but it's, adults as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you know, almost every mass shooter's been on these, and their answer is more psychiatric stuff, more kids on drugs, and the insert says can make you go totally delusional and kill people.
Almost every one of the school shooter was on the SSRIs, the Prozac type of
As
drugs.
a doctor that studies this, what's happening there? Well, I mean, why does shrimp swim up to fish and let them be eaten when they're on Prozacs? I mean, what is it doing?
Yeah, we don't know. It's a very strange drug because it produces this class of drugs that was lauded by Peter Kramer, and it makes some people go crazy. Now, if you read in the paper about a guy who kills his girlfriend, it may not be on Prozac, but if he kills his mother, he kills his kids, you look closer, and then you're going to find that guy is on SSRIs. They should have been banned by the FDA, but...
No kidding. Stay there. Let's do 5 more minutes. This is too important. I got to get this guy back on. No, that's true. Any cop I talk to, if somebody's killed her children for no reason, they know she's going to be on these. This is unnatural. SethHFarber.com. SethHFarber.com is his website. His book, The Spiritual Gift of Madness, is very good, very thought-provoking, the other side of the story. Look, there's no doubt psychiatry and psychology is predatory now. There's some good people in it that do help folks, and a lot of them have spoken out. I mean, so there's some truth to all of it. There's truth to archetypes and Jungian psychology. There's a lot of good stuff there in my humble view. And there are good counselors. There's some good there. But the thing directing it is Big Pharma, and they know full well what these drugs are doing. I know so many people that have car wrecks and have a hurt back, and they go, I think you're depressed. Here's the hospital psychologist. We need to put you on Luvox or whatever it is. Now, I know people that go on this stuff that are totally different people. Now, if somebody's completely out of their mind or whatever, trying to kill people, psychotic, yeah, whatever. But the point is, it's definitely predatory. It's the new form of slavery. And I wanted to give you some final comments, Dr. Seth Farber, on this subject, because if we live in a country where they can have psychology today, because, I mean, I run a crew of over 50 people. I work 17 hours a day, 16 hours a day. I'm a smart, hardworking guy, and I know what I'm talking about and break national news stories every week, and they say I'm mentally ill. We know this is a political weapon.
Right. Yes, they did that to Barry Goldwater in when he ran for president in 1960. The psychiatrists got together, and the thing is, they do it to people, as you say. If they can do it to you, think of the poor guy who just doesn't want to do his homework, or who isn't getting along with his teacher or something. This is a symbiotic relationship between psychiatrists. As you say, it's a parasitical system. It's like the military-industrial complex. It needs diseases. Now, what Bob Whitaker, who wrote a book, has shown now, you look at all the statistics, and in fact, so-called schizophrenics and bipolars are much, much, much more likely to get better and recover if they don't take the drugs. Now, I'm not saying, let me give a warning here now. Please, anyone listening to me, do not get off these drugs. Don't just flush them down the toilet. They're highly addictive drugs, and you must get off them slowly. But the point is, what you see, if the people who are on these drugs for the so-called antipsychotics after 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they're no longer functioning. It turns them into zombies. And we find that the people who have made a full recovery, and this is without even the best of treatment, when we have the best of treatment like we had in Soteria House and some of these other places, then they get better. Now, my first client in New York, when I came back after my PhD, was labeled schizophrenic. I got in a battle with his mother. You got it. She was calling up the clinic, wanted to get me fired, because I told him, John, you don't need these drugs. And what happened to him, Alex? I didn't know what happened to him because I got fired from the clinic for encouraging people to get off of drugs. 10 years later, he called me. This was a guy that everybody said was schizophrenic for 7 years. And he's not alone. There are many people like him today. And he got off the drugs slowly, or maybe a little too quick, and it was hard. But he'd been off the drugs for 10 years, and his parents weren't talking to him. And now it's 25 years that this person who was labeled a chronic schizophrenic has been off the drugs. And this is what happens also in the people in the mental patients liberation movement.
Well, what about A Beautiful Mind? That's a true story. He got to where he can handle it without drugs.
In fact, that's a perfect example, Alex, because you see, again, how big money corrupts. Because when they made the movie, they have him saying in the movie, these new drugs were what saved me. Whereas he said, in real life, if you read the book, he got off the drugs completely. He couldn't stand them. New drugs are old drugs. the psychiatric pharmaceutical complex has such power in American society today.
No, I read that book, and I noticed in the movie it was the opposite. Yeah. And incredible. Wow. Well, very impressive info. Dr. Seth Farber, thank you so much for coming on with us. We'll definitely get you on for a full hour soon.
Thank you, Alex. Great to meet you.
Yeah, thank you for what you're doing for people to get them to think outside the box.